John Danaher is an academic in Ireland, a philosopher who's got a blog called Philosophical Disquisitions, or Philosophic Disquisitions, to be
philosophical,
correct.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, Philosophical Disquisitions, and also writes for IEET sometimes, yeah. So yeah, we're going to be discussing Nick Bostrom's book Superintelligence and the orthogonality thesis and some of the doomsday arguments in there. So yeah, do you want to give us just a short introduction, what you're doing as an academic in Ireland, and what got you interested in superintelligence?
Yeah, so I'm actually teaching in a law school. My background is primarily in law, but since my PhD, I've been engaged in many kind of philosophy of law, looking in particular at emerging technologies and law. So originally, my main area of focus was on human enhancement and the legal regulation of human enhancement. I don't quite know why I became interested in superintelligence and artificial intelligence, but I guess it was a somewhat natural branching off point from the research on human enhancement, since a lot of these debates tend to go together. I mean, you see that in the work of people like Bostrom. They're originally focusing on human enhancement and also artificial intelligence. So like one reason for that is because the merging of the human mind with the machine is one way of achieving human enhancement, so, or cognitive enhancement in particular. So there does seem to be a natural connection between the two topics.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, once I finished my PhD, I became more engaged with the issues around AI and robotics and law. And I mean, superintelligence is one part of that. But I think there are other interesting concerns that arise from certain types of robotic kind of automation, the automation of systems, and how that affects legal decision making and how it impacts on the law. I mean, the obvious examples would be drone warfare and things like that.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm also those topics.
Yeah, and I actually saw some of those things up on your website there, and I thought, well, that would have been nice to discuss as well. But in the interest of time during this interview, like I imagine there's quite a lot to go through with superintelligence already. But maybe in another stage we can discuss drone warfare and basic income guarantee, and like an economy where humans don't have much utility to add.
Yeah, I mean, those are all worthy topics, but as you say, probably need a podcast or interview of their own to cover. So yeah, we'll focus on superintelligence for the time being.
So you've got I think a series of 6 blog posts, an earlier one on the orthogonality thesis as well, so that makes kind of 7, and then you've got another one on Luke Mulhauser and Louis Helms. What was that one on? Anyway, yes. So there's a number. Yeah, that's right.
The name of it, the Golem Genie and artificial intelligence.
Friendly AI, right? Yeah. So quite a lot of material up there actually of recent. So that's.
Yeah, I possibly have some more as well that you might have missed. And I've also written a paper in Minds and Machines about Bostrom's book.
Okay, and I didn't know about that. So
yeah, okay.
Well, just might be worth just quickly bringing up first mover advantage when it comes to AI, or like a super intelligent AI, the first mover advantage there. But maybe even stepping back a bit, we could discuss what superintelligence would entail in an artificial intelligence.
Yeah, sure.
So for those who are not familiar with the idea of a singularity intelligence explosion or anything like that.
Yeah, like the modern debate about this often centers around the notion of like AI doomsday scenarios, and the notion that a super intelligent being could, in some sense, take over the world and shape its future in a dramatic and possibly existentially threatening manner. That's what a lot of the contemporary debate is about, and that's why people like Elon Musk and to a lesser extent Bill Gates and Stephen Hawking have been talking out about this recently. But the first mover thesis is just the notion that if we created a superintelligence, the first superintelligence that's created, in virtue of being first, could achieve a decisive strategic advantage over all other intelligences in the world. So, I mean, to use maybe a slightly trivial or silly example, you can imagine the smartest and most powerful kid in the playground might be able to achieve an advantage over all his other playmates, or his or her playmates, and prevent them from acting in the way in which they wish, in virtue of the fact that they are so much superior to everyone else surrounding them. So that's the idea that a super intelligent AI, in virtue of being super intelligent and also being the first super intelligent AI, could control all other intelligences in the world. So that's the idea of the first mover thesis. It's the idea, the notion that there's a significant advantage to being the first super intelligence.
Nice. Well, maybe not so much, but onto the doomsday. Or actually, let's talk about the orthogonality thesis, and the idea that, you know, the final goals of an intelligence that is way above us might be, I guess, orthogonal to our own. What does it mean? What does it mean to have like goals or ultimate goals or final goals that are orthogonal to human goals?
Yeah, I mean, it's the claim isn't actually not so much that the goals will be orthogonal to our own, although that's certainly a possible consequence of the orthogonality thesis. The claim is more that an AI could be constructed in such a way that its intelligence and its goals are orthogonal to each other, so they can vary independently of one another. That's the way in which it's defined in Bostrom's original paper about this. So to boil it down to its essence, it means that any final goal is compatible with any level of intelligence, with more or less. There are certain limitations that Bostrom recognizes. And an illustration of this, which is often used in the debate about AI risk, is the famous example of the so-called paperclip maximizer. You could construct an artificial intelligence which has the goal of maximizing the number of paperclips in the world. That's its final goal. And it could be supremely intelligent. And by intelligence, Bostrom and others like Yudkowsky define that in terms of a capacity to solve problems in its environment that are obstacles to achieving its final goal. So it's a kind of supreme problem-solving ability. I think there's another term that Yudkowsky uses, which is that, well, general intelligence in a way is cross-domain optimization power. It's an ability to optimize one's value function across multiple different environments. It's that idea that power, that cross-domain optimization power, is compatible with any final goal. That's the essence of the orthogonality thesis. How you get from there to concerns about human extinction is just the fact that there are certain things that an AI might have to do to achieve its final goal that could encompass wiping out humanity or affecting humanity in different ways. That has to do with a second thesis that Bostrom defends, which is the so-called instrumental convergence thesis.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably worth dwelling on the orthogonality thesis first for a while, because there are some famous philosophical criticisms of that idea. And a lot of it turns on, I think, confusion about this word intelligence and what it means. So philosophers and, to an extent, cognitive scientists and possibly actually AI architects have a particular notion of intelligence that is quite a thick notion of intelligence. It's a term that is used in philosophy to mean there's a lot of other concepts associated with that larger concept, right? So when we think about an intelligent person, our thought of their intelligence brings with it lots of other assumptions about how they think and interact and behave in the world. So we typically think that an intelligent person would know that there are certain kinds of goals that are silly, that are just not worth pursuing. So if, a really intelligent human wouldn't have the goal of maximizing the number of paperclips in existence, because they would realize that that's just a pointless and irrational way to spend one's lifetime. That there are better things to focus on. So one of the philosophical objections to the notion of orthogonality is that actually, as intelligence increases, certain final goals would disappear. The superintelligence wouldn't pursue those goals because it would realize that they are silly, pointless goals to pursue.
Right. So where was I? Now, okay. I think you wrote that if, for instance, moles were real in the universe, if there was a form of moral realism out there, would the AI find it easier to converge on certain values if we didn't encode a specific end goal in it? Yeah, would the hopeful thesis, morals being real, increase the likelihood of a more beneficial outcome?
Yeah, so I mean, this is obviously a very difficult debate or topic. It's highly controversial, and the fact that it's controversial means that it may not provide much hope for somebody who is concerned about risks from AI. But that claim about moral realism is in effect the thesis that there are certain objectively true moral values. They exist somehow out there in reality. I mean, exactly how they exist out there in reality is a matter of some debate. There are different views on that, but we don't need to get into that. All you need to think about is that there are these objectively true moral values out there in the universe. So you might argue that an intelligence, one of the key attributes of an intelligence is an ability to acquire true information about its environment. And if part of its environment includes moral truths, well, then as intelligence increases, you are more likely to hit upon the moral truth. And moral truths are, according to certain views, intrinsically motivating. So once you learn that it's always and everywhere wrong to torture an innocent child for fun, let's say that's one possible kind of moral truth. Once you have acquired that truth, you'll always be motivated to follow it. So again, the claim is that as intelligence increases, you're more likely to learn the moral truth, and that means you're more likely to act in a way that is consistent with the moral truth. So this concern this claim that Bostrom has about orthogonality, that any final goal is compatible with any level of intelligence, is wrong, because certain final goals that are immoral would be prevented at higher levels of intelligence. A true superintelligence wouldn't pursue those kinds of goals. It's the same basic idea that I just laid out a moment ago, but the kind of assumption underlying it is now made explicit. The assumption is that there are these moral truths there that can be discovered by intelligence. So, yeah.
So you were talking about the motivating belief objection then, were you? You were saying if we had a goal, if we created an AI to have an ultimate goal, and it got really intelligent and then found things about the universe that I guess made it believe that certain moles were true, then it might not act on those ultimate goals that we'd programmed into it.
Yeah, if it turns out that acting in accordance with those ultimate goals is incompatible with its moral obligations, as are discovered as its intelligence increases, we wouldn't have this risk of it doing things that are incompatible with our welfare. Now, I mean, there are a few problems within that argument. I mean, there are lots of problems with it. One is that moral realism is a controversial philosophical thesis. Not everyone agrees on it. You know, some people think there are no such things as objective moral values. Some people think all moral values are relevant to human kind of mental constructs. There's a so-called constructivist moral theory, which is that moral truths, such as they are constructed out of pre-existing human values. Right? So if an AI doesn't share our values, it's going to construct a different set of moral truths, which again may not be compatible or consistent with our survival. So I mean, that's one issue with it. Another issue is that the idea that just because something is true, it will motivate us to act in a particular way is also problematic. There's a famous Humean argument. So David Hume claimed famously that desires and beliefs are completely independent of one another, and that only desires motivate behavior. And so, like, whatever you desire will dominate or trump whatever is true in the world. So you'll just always act in accordance with your desires, irrespective of whether it turns out that there are like objective moral truths that you should believe in. It's impossible to motivate somebody to act differently purely by showing them that something is not true. I mean, that's up to a limit. There are certain instrumental goals that you may need to achieve your desires, and that may depend on some truth about the world. But I mean, Hume's famous example of this was that it is not irrational to prefer to desire the destruction of the world just because you want to like scratch the end of your finger. So your desire is to scratch the end of your finger, even if that is the consequence of destroying the whole world. That desire and acting in accordance with that desire is a perfectly rational thing to do, because rationality is dictated by desire in effect rather than some greater moral truth. So yeah, that claim about the motivating belief objection based on moral realism is not consistent with that Humean theory. I may actually be messing up that Humean example, but it's roughly along those lines. That
right, yeah.
Rationality is consistent with any possible desire, I feel like.
Okay, that may be true. And it's also true that, I guess, at least in the ancestral environment, having false beliefs about the world may have had, I guess, survival bonuses, may have increased the odds of us surviving, having sort of approximations or complete illusions about how the world worked may have increased organisms' ability to survive in certain types of environments where they didn't have I guess, the cognitive ability to make perfect sense of the universe or the environment in which they were operating.
Yeah, I mean, so that's actually a really interesting example, and it raises another issue with this orthogonality thesis. So that's true. So to give an example, which is probably correct in the case of human beings and other animals, if you hear a rustle in the hedgerow, or this is quoting Led Zeppelin here, I think, but
yes.
A bustle in the hedgerow. So you hear this noise, you don't know where it's coming from, but you assume it's an agent or a predator out to get you. Now, it turns out that it's just the wind rustling in the leaves, but you run away because you hear this noise. So you have a false belief, which is motivating you to act in a particular way. But it could be that having that false belief, always assuming that whenever there's a rustle in the hedgerow, you're better off running away. That actually ensures your survival, because sometimes it might be true that there's a predator lurking in the bushes. Okay, so yeah, having a false belief allows you to achieve the long-term goal of survival better than maybe having the true belief or being more skeptical, let's say, of reality. So that's interesting, because if you go back to Bostrom's definition of intelligence, which is just really success at means-end reasoning, and a very strong ability to achieve one's goals, then it's possible that actually a really strong ability to achieve one's goals is consistent with false beliefs as well. So an AI could potentially have false beliefs about the world, but still be very good at achieving its long-term final goals. And that might be another reason to worry about the construction of a really powerful means-end reasoner. Now, the problem with that is that it's not consistent with most people's definition of intelligence, with this kind of thicker concept of intelligence, because they think that intelligence means having true beliefs about the world. But since Bostrom's definition is such a thin concept of intelligence, focusing purely on means-end reasoning, then I'm not sure that that notion that the AI could have false beliefs is inconsistent with that thin definition. Yeah, that's another kind of interesting issue that arises from the construction of AI. I think that's also like why a lot of AI theorists, well, not a lot of them, but some of them anyway, object so strenuously to some of Bostrom's arguments, because they just think it's so out of keeping with what they understand as a truly intelligent AI would be one that has much more kind of richer knowledge acquisition abilities and ability to acquire true beliefs about the world.
I was having a discussion, and we were discussing whether the AI, if motivated by moral realism or just a sort of a construct of ethics, if we're not careful and we don't include our own values or try to have the AI somehow predict what our values would be if we're smarter, stronger, smarter, and more wise, then yeah, should we then complain when the AI works out what's ethical, that it doesn't think that we are an important thing in the universe and there's much better things to do with our matter?
Yeah, I mean, so that's another point as well, that even embedded in this idea of this motivating belief objection, that as it acquires the moral truth, it will act in a way that's consistent with that. We're assuming that the moral truth is consistent with our survival, but that's not necessarily the case. And yeah, if our ultimate goal is to maximize the moral value of the universe, then we may have to countenance the fact that that doesn't include our long-term survival. That's also an interesting topic. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I don't think that was the main point of your blog post, but it is an extremely.
No, although like I am writing a paper at the moment about the notion that we should create artificial offspring, kind of non-human offspring, and that might be one of our kind of long-term goals as a human race. That might actually improve the meaning and value of our lives overall by having that as a long-term goal. But I mean, that's a notion that's common to some kinds of transhumanist thinking, but I don't know if it's always been defended in the best possible terms. So I'm trying to improve the defense of it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'll look forward to reading that one. Now, yes, I guess for the viewer's benefit, Nick Bostrom, who wrote Superintelligence, was one of the founders of the World Transhumanist Association, which got rebranded as Humanity Plus, alongside David Pearce, who was just recently in Australia, and I got to discuss at length with him about a lot of things. And one of the theses he has is we should eradicate suffering, but also maximize bliss. In that order, really. So yeah, I was just wondering, just briefly, if there's a moral truth that can be gained from looking at the universe and finding some sort of correlate to valence, whether that be at basement level physics or or as some form of information theoretic justifiable, I guess, moral, that we should reduce suffering and increase hedonism or pleasure, positive hedonism. Yeah, that I guess that ties into what we were discussing before. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the hedonistic imperative.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I don't necessarily share David Pearce's entire moral grounding here, but I certainly think that conscious pleasure and conscious well-being is a component of moral value and moral good, but I'm not sure if it is the totality of it. I mean, one concern I would have about that claim is that it denies certain forms of moral agency, or at least it reduces the need for this. So in moral theory, there's a distinction sometimes drawn between a moral agent and a moral patient. So a moral agent is a being that can act in the world, has a certain amount of autonomy, has responsibility for its actions, and has responsibility for shaping its own future. And it also owes duties to other moral beings in the universe. A moral patient is an entity that has no real autonomy and no real responsibility, but it is a recipient of moral benefits. So if you are a moral agent, you will owe moral duties to a moral patient. The famous example of this would be the distinction between human beings and animals. So human beings are moral agents, they have moral duties, they have moral responsibility, whereas animals, conscious animals, at least within some theories like Peter Singer and David Pearce, I'm sure would be in agreement on this, that we owe moral duties to animals. We should protect them. We shouldn't kill them and eat them, for example. We should ensure their kind of conscious bliss or their conscious well-being as best as possible. All right. So my concern is that ensuring the conscious well-being of all human beings might, or is at least consistent with denying their moral agency, right, or minimizing their capacity to act in the world, or their capacity to act responsibly in the world. And this actually crops up a number of times in so-called AI doomsday scenarios. So, I mean, one of the concerns that Wallstrom has and raises in his book is, well, we could try and program an AI to ensure that we're all happy, okay? But the AI's definition of happiness might be just to, paralyze us, hook us up to some brain-computer interaction device that constantly triggers like the pleasure circuits or reward circuits in our brains. So we're really happy forever, but we're not acting in the real world anymore. We're not doing anything. So we become moral patients in that sense, recipients of well-being, but we're no longer moral agents. So I think there is a danger in the hedonistic imperative, at least in some of its expressions, that you focus almost entirely on that notion of conscious well-being, conscious bliss, and you deny other relevant parts of what makes for a valuable or meaningful or worthwhile existence.
I guess, yeah, David would say that he's searching for information-sensitive gradients of bliss, meaning that it would imply there that he's looking for a sort of a meaningful, flourishing version of bliss, not peak experience, injected into us for time and all eternity. So I think, especially when you think about, well, if we do find a way to achieve like a really high level of bliss, and we dumb ourselves down to lotus eaters, milksops, we may not be interested in exploration. So we're just exploiting all that we've found up to that particular point. Even if the ultimate goal was bliss, it would make sense to put some resources into flourishing ways of exploring around the universe, so that we may be able to discover new ways of achieving bliss. But in any sense, I'm also a little bit worried about just having a repeated cycle of some form of like a frame of bliss that can be just recycled or repeated over and over again. It doesn't really seem like a very meaningful existence. It's like Nozick's experience machine, like set to fall forever and ever and ever. It could be quite blissful, but that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, like I will say, one thing about David's work that it's much more carefully worked out and nuanced than I'm presenting it as being. And one thing that's good about it is that he does emphasize this fact that not everyone shares the kind of same baseline levels of well-being and bliss, and that there are good moral reasons we're thinking we should try and kind of level them up a bit, or change the baseline for some people, and that may actually be a neglected topic in moral theory. I think it might be fair to say that, because I think there may be actually too much of a focus on the value of moral agency and the rejection of kind of pure states of conscious well-being. So I mean, I think Nozick's view that we don't want to live in the experience machine is dominant, really, in moral philosophy, and it's good to have some degree of pushback against that. That, you know, there is an important value at stake here, and we don't want to deny that either. Yeah.
Yes, so we've just been discussing the orthogonality thesis and some perturbations and some meanderings of interest. So also the next up on the list, which relates to the orthogonality thesis, is the instrumental convergence thesis there. What is the instrumental convergence? It seems similar to Steve Omohundro's basic AI drives, in a sense.
Yeah, it's effectively the same idea. I think, actually, in many ways, the instrumental convergence thesis is more crucial to Bostrom's kind of doomsday scenario than the orthogonality thesis. It's a somewhat difficult notion for people to grasp, because they focus on the idea that, because final goals can be anything, that's what creates the potential danger from superintelligence. But in reality, it's actually the convergent goals that an AI would pursue. So one analogy that I use to kind of explain this idea is with evolutionary theory. The notion that there are certain kind of adaptations to an environment that an organism can discover through the process of, genetic mutation and incremental change over time, that help it to survive and help it to kind of make a living in different environments. So Daniel Dennett refers to these as good tricks of evolution, and they're kind of repeat over time. So eyesight has evolved in 40 different ways in different environments over evolutionary history, because it's a good trick. It's a good way of achieving an outcome. So the idea was that the instrumental convergence thesis is possibly more important to Bostrom's doomsday argument than the orthogonality thesis. And I was using this analogy between evolutionary theory and AI theory. So in evolutionary theory, there's this claim that there are certain kinds of adaptations that are good tricks. They're good ways of making a living across a range of different environments. The concept of a good trick is associated with the work of Daniel Dennett. One example would be eyesight. Eyesight has evolved in 40 different ways across multiple environments, because being able to pick up different wavelengths of light, that's a valuable adaptation in many different contexts. So the notion of an instrumental goal for an AI is a very similar idea. It's the claim that there are certain ways of achieving one's goals, certain sub-goals, that are useful no matter what your final goal happens to be. And so one of the main ones that Bostrom talks about is there are a few of them, actually, he mentions it in the book. One is actually cognitive enhancement would be a useful instrumental goal. So any AI would try to enhance its cognitive capacity, because an ability to process more information about the world, acquire more true beliefs, is so the argument goes anyway, consider a better way of ensuring that you achieve your final goals. The main one, though, that is of interest in the present context is the instrumental goal of resource acquisition. Right? So in order to achieve your final goals, you need to manipulate resources in the real world, take advantage of energy sources and so forth that enable you to achieve your final goals. And that's where the big problem might come. I think Eliezer Yudkowsky had this quote from several years ago that an AI doesn't care about you or who you are, but you were made from atoms that it can use for some other purpose. And that's the basic idea, that the real world consists of material resources that an AI will want to acquire, change, alter in such a way as to achieve its final goals. And this is expressed very clearly in the example of the paperclip maximizer. If its final goal is to maximize the number of paper clips in existence, this means you've got to convert material resources in the world into paper clips. So you want to acquire as many material resources as you can, and through some kind of technology, maybe it's nanotechnology, converting the world into a kind of computronium. You want to use all the resources to create all these paper clips. And that's potentially where the big risk to humanity comes, because we are resources that can be used as well to achieve the final goals of the AI.
Conveniently located resources on the surface of a planet of its origin.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
It's not just, it wouldn't just be taking human atoms alone. It would be, it would probably see us as just objects or constructs that can dissolve into something. It can be more useful if it was just solely bent on creating paper clips. But not just humans. I mean, rocks and trees and all other mountains and whatnot. It's just that we're conveniently located as much as all the other atoms around it are.
We're conveniently located resources. However, there is one reason to think that an AI might target us, is because, well, we might be impediments or obstacles to achieving its goals, since we are rational agents who might be more likely to put up a fight or something. So there's more of a need to target us than the rocks, because the rocks can wait till later, whereas we're going to try and resist our acquisition before that. Yeah,
might want to protect its power source or its resources, and it may see us as having a slightly bigger threat to it than a rock, so it may decide to, decompose us into atoms and turn these atoms into more RAM or computonium, as you just said, in order to maximize paper clipping. But so you spoke about Dennett's good trick, and there's a related thing that Dennett wrote about called a forced move.
Yeah.
Is that pretty much the same as the good trick argument?
I guess a good trick, it's a little bit different insofar as the good trick, there are maybe multiple possible routes that, in Dennett's case, so that an organism could take through design space. Okay, so there's a space of possible designs for organisms, and there are a number of peaks within that design space that represent evolutionarily stable outcomes. A forced move is that you might get trapped in some portion of design space where you have to do a certain thing. I can't remember what examples Dennett uses to illustrate this idea, but again, that could be true for AIs as well, where in evolutionary theory we talk about design space. In AI theory we might talk about mind space, a space of possible mental constructions.
Right.
And again, within that space there are good tricks, and maybe there are also forced moves, that if a rational actor or a means end reasoner is backed into a certain corner, there's a certain kind of sub goal or action that it has to take in order to get out of that corner. It's a forced move, and again, those forced moves could include or encompass threats to human existence as well.
Yeah, I guess an interesting distinction between evolution by natural selection and I guess intelligent design is, well, intelligent design. We're not talking about
Intelligent agency.
God to it. Intelligent agency, and is that well, intelligent. Its ultimate goal could be pretty much many things. I'm not sure about anything, but it could be many things. Whereas with evolution, it seems to be survival, or a gene's making copies itself in the ancestral environment.
Yeah, I mean that's probably the big difference between mind space and design space. Design space is geared around one final goal in particular, whereas mind space could be geared towards many different possible final goals. Yeah, and that might make the. I mean, one thing about evolutionary theory, because we know that the survival or copies of genes in future generations, that's the final goal of, in a sense, of all organisms. That means we can probably make better predictions about where adaptations, where future adaptations will go, or we have a better sense of what is a good trick or not. Whereas in the case of mind space, that might actually be a lot more difficult to work out if there are many possible final goals. There are things in there that we just are so completely alien to our understanding of the universe that we might never be able to predict them. Yeah.
Well, what about goal content integrity? We spoke a little bit before about if an AI finds something fundamentally true about the universe, that its goals contradict. What would that mean then for its potential sub goal or of goal content integrity?
Yeah, I mean, what would it mean if it discovers something about the world that is inconsistent with its final goal? Don't know what would happen in that context. It would be interesting. They might get trapped in some kind of loop of some kind that it can't get out of. That's a possibility.
Right.
But I mean, the goal content integrity as an idea is just this notion that an AI will have to keep its goal consistent or in the same basic shape until it achieves it. So this is, if you like, this is the equivalent of survival in the evolutionary case. So evolutionarily speaking, you have to survive until you pass on your genes, I guess, is the in order to achieve that kind of evolutionary goal. Bostrom says that well, an AI mightn't really care about its long-term survival, but it does care about achieving its goals, and it has to keep those goals in place until they're achieved, if you like. Although he kind of pushes back against that idea a couple of times. Just trying to find the example, if I can.
Yeah, well, I mean, while you're looking for that, I find it just interesting that a lot of the goals that seem to be focused on in the literature seem to be very narrow, like paperclip maximizing. They're not complex goals. They're not like a complex ecosystem of values or goals. They're more like just this is it, just one goal. And people argue that a more complex ecosystem of goals could lend itself more to a friendly sort of AI than one that's just focusing on just a narrow goal architecture. Or
Yeah.
narrow subset of goals, or just even just one goal.
I mean, I think that's a fair kind of criticism of some of the thought experiments that are used in this debate. I mean, the paperclip maximizer example is kind of silly because I don't know if anyone can imagine an AI project creating a paperclip maximizer. That's unlikely to be it's unlikely to be the goal of any computer scientist or AI theorist, I would suspect.
Right.
But
the value of thought experiments is really to constrain as much as possible the conditions upon what we're making decisions or we're sort of, the search space of, I guess, possible outcomes within a thought experiment. The constraint is useful in that environment, but what I see is people take the thought experiments and their constraints and then extrapolate them to actual reality, and maybe sometimes it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just more difficult to have thought experiments to humans to mull over that are very complex. So we need to think of narrow
AI,
constrained ways of thinking about things.
Yeah. I think maybe a better example would be something like a self-driving car or vehicle. I mean, there's a sense in which that has a very narrow goal. I guess it would be to get you to your destination safely and in a reasonably fuel-efficient manner. Let's say it has those kind of two goals within it. And then there are obviously lots of things it needs to be able to do to navigate through an environment successfully. So that's where its intelligence comes in, is this ability to respond to changes in its environment, even though it has a relatively narrow set of final goals. But I'm not sure. I think maybe actually constructing a really successful self-driving car would involve many more goals as well. I'm just thinking, even as I run through it now in my own head, it would probably involve a lot more than just safety and fuel efficiency, because you'd have multiple possible definitions of safety, and maybe there's some overall regulations and rules that the car has to be consistent with as well in its driving. So there are lots of interesting questions that are thrown up in these cases. And I mean, even in the study or some of the debate about self-driving cars now, you see questions about moral dilemmas. What if like a child ran in front of your car, and the only way to avoid it was to crash the car into a wall, which would kill you as a passenger? What way should the AI be programmed in that case? Should it save your life, or should it save the child's life? There are kind of different decision-making dilemmas that an AI could be trapped in, which could affect us as well in serious ways. Some people think the solution to that is to get like the owners of self-driving cars to pick their own kind of their own suite of moral preferences for the car, which could be
as long as they don't involve crashing into anybody else on purpose, or their moral value was to end as many lives as possible.
I think the idea is that you'd only be allowed to choose in cases where there's room for serious disagreement as to what the morally preferable outcome is. But yeah, look at the dangers in all of this.
If I was having a bad morning, if I knew that my car was like an extreme negative utilitarian, I'd have some worries about getting in the car. If it thought that I was suffering and decided to end that, I'd rather not get in the car. I'd rather just suffer for a morning and wait until I feel better.
Yeah, you see there, like once you start including these other types of goals that an AI needs to have, that it needs to be consistent with moral norms as well. Really, like any AI project worth its salt is going to be far more complex than anything like a paperclip maximizer as we're imagining it in the thought experiment. Yeah, and I mean there is perhaps a danger in extrapolating from the thought experiment to everything. Into reality, even though they're useful constructs.
Yeah. Another thing is, we're talking about, actually, Steve Omohundro has spoken about, I guess, what Ben Goertzel calls a social safety net, and Steve Omohundro calls it more like a sort of ecosystem of AIs that are checking and balancing each other. I mean, when you look at likelihoods of the type of AI that might arise, do you think that a singleton is much more likely than like more of an ecosystem of AIs, or more of like a hive or swarm AI?
I think an ecosystem is more likely. That's my guess. One reason for that is I'm a little bit skeptical of these kind of hard takeoff scenarios for superintelligences. I think the concept of a singleton depends to a large extent on the notion that the first superintelligence will be able to kind of ramp itself up and assume dominance over the world in a sense. But I think that's probably unlikely. I think I don't really have a good argument for this. It's just more of an intuition based on the belief that actually, certainly if you look at human history, reform or advances in, let's say, scientific discovery have in a sense kind of slowed down over time. There's lots of low-hanging fruit to acquire initially, kind of deep insights, and then it becomes more difficult, a more collaborative program requiring a lot more resources, and there are ways in which it's slower and more incremental. And I think that might be true of advances in intelligence as well, once you get above a certain level. So yeah, we're more likely to create an ecosystem of kind of competing superintelligences than a singleton.
Interesting point. I mean, when you think about the sorts of decision theory that we're using, that Bostrom or Yudkowsky might use in their books, is probably because it's much easier to think about like one AI and the implications. We seem to have a lot more sort of work done, philosophical work done around morals and decision theories about single agents and how they should act, and it seems, well, at least to me, the development around how to deal with, the risks associated with a more like an ecosystem of AI, a future super intelligent ecosystem could be worth pursuing as well. Yeah, but anyway, I think I just realised that we're probably diverging a bit here if I keep on talking about things that weren't discussed in Bostrom's book. Yeah. Yeah,
no, it's okay. I really think it's a fair point, because it's much easier to deal with, like, even in game theory, let's say, interactions between two agents. They're relatively tractable, but then once you go on to 3, 4, it's really, really hard to compute the different possible outcomes and the ideal strategy. You need the help of a computational agent to do that. Sorry,
which
anyway.
leads us to the point that we may be able to use AGI or superintelligence in order to help us work these sorts of problems out as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially if it's a sort of superintelligence that has that kind of goal and isn't really into self-preservation, and may not even be a general intelligence. Could be a brittle AI that's really good at doing that one thing. People argue that, well, maybe it's the sort of problem that can't be solved very easily with a narrow, brittle intelligence. But who knows? Definitely worth a try.
Yeah, worth exploring for sure.
So the devil's pitchfork. Let's talk about some doomsday arguments. So look, there's a number of doomsday scenarios, but let's talk about the basics. There's a three-pronged argument there for doom. There's 3 basic theses. The first mover on the orthogonality thesis and the instrumental thesis. But how do the conjunction of these theses matter? What do they imply?
Yeah, so the first mover thesis tells us that the first superintelligence will have a decisive strategic advantage. So it'll have power or dominating power over all other intelligences. So that's one kind of key claim. The orthogonality thesis says that superintelligence could have any possible final goal. And then the instrumental convergence thesis tells us that it will do certain kinds of things to achieve its goals, certain good tricks that it will use, which might include or are likely to include acquiring and manipulating resources, including human beings. So that seems to lead to the implication, and this is actually a direct quote from Bostrom, that the first superintelligence may have the power, that's in brackets, that's my own addition to it, I just kind of modified the quote slightly. So it may have the power to shape the future of Earth-originating life, could easily have non-anthropomorphic final goals, and would likely have instrumental reasons to pursue open-ended resource acquisition. Okay? So when you combine that then with the claim, and this is again a direct quote from Bostrom, that human beings consist of useful resources such as conveniently located atoms, and that we depend for our survival and flourishing on many other local resources, that seems to lead to the conclusion that the first superintelligence could have the power and reason to do things that lead to human extinction by appropriating the resources that we rely upon for our flourishing, or by simply using us as resources. So that's in effect the argument for the doomsday scenario in Bostrom's book, anyway. You combine the three theses, the first mover, orthogonality, and instrumental convergence, with claims about human beings and how they rely and depend on resources, and you reach that worrying conclusion that human extinction is a distinct possibility in a future consisting of superintelligent AI.
I think, like in an earlier blog post, you sort of spoke about, was it the skeptic, the religious skeptic, was it? The idea that, you know, you cannot know God's will or something like that, and that's because you can't. You cannot say that there's no repugnant evil. All evils are justified, even though you can't explain how they're justified. We can say that, and by the same token, all possibilities of AI, however remote, of it going bad, should be considered and weighted. But it's very hard to give these sorts of doomsday possibilities a certain weight, I find.
Yeah, I think, like, to me, this is potentially the biggest problem with the whole debate about AI risk. That if you read books like Bostrom's and more recent books by other people like Roman Yamplowski, I think that's his name anyway. They countenance lots of different possible outcomes, and it's a good example of scenario planning. You try and imagine every possible way in which things could go wrong, and then hopefully by identifying all these possibilities, you can act in certain ways that protect against the less desirable ones or less ideal ones. But there's a danger if you can't assign any kind of probabilistic weight to the different possible outcomes. And it's not clear to me that certainly within Bostrom's argumentative framework, that there is any way to assign a weight or a probability to the different outcomes. I see this most clearly in his defense of that doomsday argument. So I've outlined the basic argument, the three theses, and how they lead to the conclusion that human resources could be used in ways that are inconsistent with our survival, our long-term survival. Now, there are two kind of objections to that point of view. You can say, well, look, number one, we could just program AI with benevolent goals. We know roughly what is consistent with human flourishing, so we can just ensure that an AI does things that are consistent with human flourishing. And Bostrom says that's no good, because actually our ideas about what are consistent with our flourishing and what would be benevolent for us are very vague, and an AI might interpret them in different ways. It might lead to what he calls perverse instantiation. So it instantiates our goal in a perverse way. Again, if we gave it the very simple goal of making us happy, it could instantiate that by freezing the muscles on our face and making us smile. That's one example he uses. That's kind of a simple human language example. Obviously, the reality would be that it's some kind of computer code, some goal that's encoded in a computer language, which would be a little bit different. So he kind of discounts that possibility, although he has other maybe ways in which we could program it to be benevolent. He has certain proposals as well. The other objection to his doomsday argument is something I call like the safety testing objection. It's like, well, look, when we're creating an artificial intelligence, we can create it in a safe environment, in a box, as it's so called, a locked down environment where it can't really affect the world. We can simulate different possible outcomes. We can get it maybe to interact with some test subjects, test human beings, And from this, we can observe its behavior, and we can see that it's safe, that it doesn't actually harm or injure human beings. So if we do enough of that kind of safety testing, we should feel confident about releasing it into the wider environment. Now, Bostrom responds to this argument by relying on a concept he calls the treacherous turn, which is that like any AI could actually, a superintelligent AI that has a long-term goal that it wants to achieve that does include human destruction or human extinction could conceal its true nature while in the box. It may, it's going to be smarter than us. It's going to realize that we are testing it and trying to see whether we should release it. So it can do one of two things. It can play dumb, it can pretend to be stupider than it really is, or it can play nice. It can pretend to be cooperating with us and actually change its tune once it's released into the environment. So there's always this risk of an AI taking a treacherous turn. So there's a sense then in which like no amount of safety testing should ever convince us that an AI is really friendly or really benevolent, because we can't really understand its long-term strategic thinking. It's just so much smarter and so alien to us.
So there's no amount of empirical evidence which we can use. Are you saying there's no we can't like scientific testing?
That's what it seems to me. That's the implication of that argument. And again, in a way, it's consistent with what we know about human rational or strategic actors. That, in a sense, there's any kind of almost any action that a human takes is consistent with some sort of long-term goal, strategic goal. And it can be very hard to predict what a human agent will do if you don't know what its long-term goal is, or you don't know how it thinks about the world. There's a kind of an illustration of this in the movie The Princess Bride. I don't know if you've ever seen this.
I've seen the movie The Princess Bride, yes.
There's a famous game within it where they play the poison chalice game. I put poison in the glass, and there's two glasses in front of the two people. I put poison as one of them, and the other guy has to figure out which glass he should drink. And he goes through like multiple rounds of reasoning. He says, well, you're not the kind of guy who'd put the poison in the glass in front of him, so it must be in the glass in front of me, therefore I should choose your glass. And he says, well, actually, you would have known that I would have thought that about you, so you would have put it in the other glass. And then it goes into multiple kind of variations as well. You would have known that I would have known this, therefore you would have put it in the other one. There's no kind of stability, there's no end to that kind of reasoning. There's a sense in which when we're trying to think about our strategic interactions with an AI, we get stuck in a similar trap, right? We might think it's playing nice, but actually its behavior is consistent with long-term malevolence. And the point is that its behavior is always consistent with long-term benevolence, or sorry, long-term malevolence. Or malevolence might be the wrong word, because some people associate that with like ill will or bad intent towards us.
Maybe indifference.
Yeah, it could be just long-term indifference. So that's where I drew in the analogy with the debate about evil in the philosophy of religion. Because in the philosophy of religion, people, the problem of evil is a famous objection to the existence of God. We see lots of instances of suffering in the real world, and it seems to us that that suffering is pointless. It's difficult to actually think about and imagine all the different forms of suffering in the world. But there's lots of suffering of conscious or sentient animals in nature. There's predator-prey relationships. There's natural disasters. There's all these things, and none of it seems like it's absolutely necessary for any long-term greater good. But theists respond to that objection by saying, well, look, it might seem to you that these things aren't justifiable, but really you don't know enough about what God's plans are or what the true nature of moral value is. God knows those things. So it could be, for all you know, that the suffering you see is consistent with or necessary for some greater good in the long term. And Bostrom is kind of making a similar move in his response to this safety testing objection. He says, well, it might seem to you that what the AI is doing is benevolent or is consistent with human survival, but you don't really know its kind of long-term plans or what the, somebody who's reasoning or thinking about 10,000 years in the future or 1,000,000 years in the future, that kind of long-term strategic thinking that an AI might engage in. It could be that what it's doing is actually consistent with long-term human extinction or problems for humanity in the long term. So, like, people in the debate about the problem of evil will say there's no amount of empirical evidence about human suffering that we could acquire that will tell us whether that suffering is truly inconsistent with a long-term greater good. And again, it looks like Bostrom's making a similar move with his objection to safety testing, that there's no amount of empirical evidence we could observe about an AI that could convince us that actually in the long term it won't act in a way that is contrary to our interests. No, I should say, like, I'm sure Bostrom would deny that if he was pushed on it. He would say, well, no, there probably are some ways that we can assign weight, probabilistic weight to things. But that's kind of that's besides the point, because it just seems to me that within his argumentative framework, this notion of the treacherous turn makes it impossible to assign those kinds of weights, because it's all, at least the way he describes it, it's always possible that there's some kind of so it's always possible that there's something we're missing in our empirical observations.
Yeah, okay. And I guess this is one of the reasons why, well, especially the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, are very interested in creating provably friendly AI, not just verifiably, but I mean provably. Yeah. In terms, it's a formalization of friendliness in such a way that it can be logically proven to work in any situation. If that's possible, maybe that's what Nick Bostrom is sort of hoping for, and I mean that'd be very nice. But it seems as though people bring up the rice theory objection, and that is, the more complex the inputs are to any system, the less predictable the outputs will be. Okay, so in something as complex as an AI, and there's something as complex as the inputs, and what we want to value and all those sorts of things seem like Rice's theorem will be a major impediment to provably friendly AI. That is, unless Rice's theorem is based on current understandings of mathematics, unless there's some way that we develop a new form of maths that can sort of solve that problem. And I'm not sure whether that's what the Machine Intelligence Research Institute wants to do. I think it's worth checking out. I think it's worth looking at that. I do know that Luke Mulhauser at one stage did say that we may need a completely new form of mathematics to solve AI friendliness, but I'm not sure if he was referring to the sort of mathematics that could deal with provably friendly AI, even like with Rice's theorem as it is.
Yeah, I mean,
are you aware of Rice's theorem?
I'm not aware of Rice's theorem, but I think the notion of provably friendly AI seems to me like a good idea or good maybe goal in principle, but I suspect it is going to be very difficult to actually achieve in practice, to achieve this kind of provability of friendliness.
Yes.
I mean,
I've spoken to some people at the Future of Humanity Institute, and they're not just focused on provably friendly AI. They're from what I heard, that they characterize the Machine Intelligence Research Institute as being more focused on the trying to achieve provable friendliness, and the Future of Humanity Institute trying to just increase the likelihood of friendly AI. So it's interesting that Nick Bostrom does seem to not put too much focus on trying to work out how to probabilistically assess the likelihood of friendliness in his book there.
Mm. I think part of the problem, though, might be just like the way in which the concept of superintelligence is it's a very tricky concept, and it is consistent with many different possible futures. Potentially a super intelligent AI with really advanced technologies at its disposal, like nanotechnologies or whatever, could realize any physically possible future. It would be within its power to achieve almost any physically possible reality. And once you have that kind of level of power, it means you have a vast space of possible worlds that this future AI could explore, and it's just very difficult to assign any kind of probabilistic weight to all those different possible futures. I think that's the problem. There's in philosophy, and we refer to this as issues arising from modality, what's possible, what's necessary, what's actual. And the modal standards of success in arguments about AI seem to me to be very high, or about AI risk. So you have to prove. So even if it's not possible to prove, like absolutely, that a friendly AI is logically provable, it may nevertheless be possible to prove that the AI is friendly across a range of possible worlds. Okay, but there's always other possible worlds that a super intelligent AI could explore, or could realize.
Well, one of the things we probably didn't mention is the possible bright future that AI could really bring to humanity. We've been talking about doom and gloom a bit. It might be just worth just touching on, even if just for a minute, the astronomical stakes that could be at store. So look, with AI, I guess it could solve some of the humanity's most difficult problems that are lying ahead of us. It could allow us to maybe able to completely recalibrate our hedonic mechanism and increase our hedonic set point to, in orders of magnitude what it is now, and could eliminate suffering and have awesome, I guess, theories of fun that we could explore novelty forever, for instance. That would be a wonderful outcomes there. But as long as we make sure we get it right, because there's, as Nick Bostrom said, if I think it's within this galaxy supercluster there could be 10 to the power of 40 to the power of 45 or something lives that could exist in this galaxy supercluster, not the universe. The universe is 10 to the power of 50 something, I forget, possible lives that could be saved or that could be realized. Saved is probably not the right word, but realized if we don't become extinct. And AI could either be the cause of the extinction, or it could be the way that we avoid extinction in other areas of extinction risk.
So a lot of those kind of long-term bright futures, what strikes me about the conversation in relation to them is that, to me anyway, it seems like there's a somewhat impoverished vision of what a bright future is, since a lot of it just depends on ensuring that we have a wonderful experience or have a wonderful time, or we can solve poverty and all kind of social problems, or we can raise hedonic set points, we can kind of live in blissful virtual reality environments. There's all these kinds of different scenarios that people discuss. One thing that I would suggest that comes back to a point we made earlier is that it might be that actually the utopian future, the bright future, is one in which artificially intelligent beings dominate, and that we create our own kind of evolutionary successors, who have, one of the kind of visions of futurists, or one of the desires of futurists, is long-term space exploration or migration. That doesn't seem to be very possible in our current biological form.
Right.
So again, it might be creating successor artificial beings that ensures that we can achieve those long-term projects, those long-term goals. And that might actually incorporate our eventual extinction. I mean, the extinction of the human race, let's say.
But still realizing a lot of happy, flourishing lives.
Yes, exactly.
Utility fogs exploring the universe or whatever.
Yeah, they'll just be artificial beings in the future.
Yeah, artificial beings, or like living in actual reality as utility fog, or simulated reality. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's also the issue of whether we prioritize reality over virtual reality as well, and whether that prioritization is defensible, which is, I think, an interesting philosophical question as well. That gets back to Nozick's experience machine issue.
Yeah,
as well.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are scenarios in the future that are bright. I think the question about AI doomsday scenarios and extinction scenarios often boils down to the notion that, well, there's an extreme of really good outcomes and there's an extreme of really bad outcomes, and in fact, it's either going to be one or the other. I think that's the view of Bostrom, if I recall correctly, that we're unlikely to land somewhere in the middle. That's just a mediocre future with AI. It's going to lie at one extreme or the other. Maybe that's not Bostrom's view. Maybe that's Stuart Armstrong's. I can't remember. It's one of the people from the FHI.
Okay. So that's not something you really can be too sure about, I guess.
No, I mean, I guess it would be interesting if it turns out that the future is really mediocre. That would be an interesting kind of counterpoint to those views. But there aren't many people running around crying about the possibility of a mediocre future.
No.
It doesn't tend to excite people.
Well, do you reckon the present is mediocre? I mean, if you compare it to the past.
No, I don't. So I'm kind of bought into the argument that, at least in terms of human well-being, the present is better than the past. If you presented me with the choice of would I like to live in the Renaissance or in the Roman Empire versus nowadays, I think I would choose nowadays. Maybe that's because I have a kind of status quo bias. I know what the present is like. That seems pretty good to me. Maybe I would disagree if I had been situated in a different point in the past. But it seems to me like the possibilities that are open to human beings, lifespan, just global transportation, interaction, cosmopolitanism, access to knowledge. We're kind of advanced at all those levels over where we were in the past. So those seem like good things to me. And that's also one actually argument that some people offer against the whole idea of orthogonality as well, is that it seems that as human knowledge has increased, as human intelligence has increased, things have gotten better overall. So we might reason by analogy that, well, if an artificial intelligence gets better, gets more intelligent, things will get better as well. So that might be one kind of counterpoint to Bostrom's concerns.
Well, I'm certainly all for trying to mitigate the possibility of AI going unfriendly and addressing the problems as Nick Bostrom does so well, and trying to reduce the risk of very negative outcomes for us humans, or just generally negative outcomes for the future life of the universe. Seems like a very very good thing to do. relatively underfunded compared to, I think Nick Boston brought up the amount of funding that dung beetles have. The research on dung beetles, and even a subcategory of like research on dung beetles, like mating rituals of dung beetles, seem to have got so much more funding than research into making AI friendly. It's ridiculous.
No, it's just,
I don't know if it's the case anymore, but it certainly was not too long ago, maybe 2 years ago.
well, you know, there's research funding that is allocated to other projects that what people might say, you know, in terms of long-term benefits, are fairly slim, like, you know, interpretations of Robert Frost's poetry or something. There are people who get like sometimes get large grants to pursue those kinds of research projects as well. I don't necessarily want to discount the value to those projects entirely. It seems like there probably is some value to them. But like Boston is to be commended for coming up with a whole kind of field of inquiry, in a sense. I mean, this concept of existential risk and the notion that there is low-hanging fruit in research terms to be kind of caught or picked, right, I guess. If we pursue these areas, it seems correct to me, and it seems like that's something that should be funded and rewarded. Even if you disagree ultimately with, you know, his long-term conclusions, you know, the amount of funding that is required for engaging in that research is relatively small at the moment compared to the amount of funding allocated to other things that are possibly of a more dubious long-term value.
There's a certain, like, I don't know, it seems to be quite a, you know, in some areas of future communities, they're interested in the singularity. There's pro-singularitarians who think that, you know, it's a sure thing that AI will be friendly, or the probability of it going bad is so low that it's not worth considering. And then there's people on the other side who sort of barrack for the cause that AI will go bad unless we're extremely, extremely careful. And to some degree, I'm not talking about everybody in these communities, but to some degree, especially those who are like saying like negative things about doomsayers all the time and completely discounting their arguments. There seems to be a little bit of like, you know, like a barracking for one side or the other, or some sort of like a irrational conviction for one style of belief, one's, you know, or the other.
Yeah,
Some
I mean,
people
it is
that, you know, just magically merging with the machines will solve all our problems. For instance, all we need to do is just like become a organism, and everything will be sweet. For instance.
Yeah, like, it's sad in one sense that you see all the foibles and eccentricities of human psychology playing out in the debate about AI risk as well. That it does seem to branch into two camps, like both of whom think the other side are idiots or have their heads in the sand or whatever. Or like, I see that particularly on some of the Facebook groups that I'm members of, that you just get complete dismissal of the AI risk case by some people. That's, you know, unscientific. There's a complete lack of any kind of rationality or empiricism to it, and that it's really a kind of religious belief. But then also on the other side, you get the notion that, well, the faith in the future, the kind of pro-singularitarian position that actually everything's going to be fine, is also critiqued as being quasi a religious idea. I mean, religion is often used in pejorative terms anyway in these communities.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
I mean,
well,
it's sad that we do fall into those camps, and there's you're already going to do and say anything to support your side in that argument.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I try not to do that in my own work, but no doubt I fall prey to the same kinds of.
We're all human, aren't we? Yeah, but I did notice that you did seem quite sober-minded when I read your posts, and I thought, well, that's the reason why I wanted to talk to you specifically about this, because, well, you seem to be like have a balanced, more of a balanced view that I've seen in some areas.
Yeah, I definitely don't discount the risk, AI risk. I'm not necessarily its biggest advocate either. One of the things I say in the paper that I wrote about Bostrom's treacherous turn concept is that I'm aware, drawing analogies between AI risk and the debate about AI risk and religious beliefs has been used to pejorative ends in the past. That the singularity is a rapture for the nerds, or that belief in superintelligence takeoff is fideistic, it's faith-based belief. So I don't want to draw upon those kind of pejorative connotations in my work. I think one of the claim I make is that what I'm interested in is trying to debug the argumentative framework that's being used. There are certain problems within it, I think, but they could be overcome if we think about it in more detail. And I think there certainly are risks from AI that should be taken seriously. It seems obvious to me that there are, and there are risks and benefits at much lower levels of intelligence as well that are worth considering. But that's a separate, another day's conversation probably.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I certainly have enjoyed reading your posts, and I noticed that you did get quite a way through the book Superintelligence, and it must have been, quite a task to achieve, amongst other commitments that you probably have at your university and teaching and everything. So yeah, while I do encourage you to continue on from chapter 10, I think you're up to.
I focused mainly on the kind of doomsday portion of the book because I thought that was the part that most people would be interested in and that I was interested in myself. But yeah, I don't know if I'll write any more posts about it, but I certainly maintain interest in the topic and do blog and write about similar things all the time.
Oh yeah. That's wonderful. So we've covered a lot of ground today. Surely, there's more things that could be said about, boxing and different types of boxing into or whatnot, and mind crimes and infrastructure perfusion and all sorts of things. But I guess it's been going for about an hour and a half now, so I am aware that you've got jobs and things and tasks that you need to get done. So it's been wonderful having you on the show, and maybe we can continue this conversation later, or pick up another conversation on moral enhancement or the future of automation,
work and employment,
non-employment.
I am happy to talk about all these topics. I write about them frequently. So it was nice talking to you too. It was great. Honor to be on your show. Lots of other illustrious guests in the past, and to count myself among them is a privilege.
My pleasure, John. It's been wonderful having you, and I'm looking forward to reading more of your blog.
Okay, thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.